What's one family saying or phrase you heard growing up that still sticks with you?
Every Christmas, I picked up the bill without complaint, even when the numbers printed at the bottom made my stomach twist and my smile feel brittle. I did it because I thought it meant something, because for years I told myself that covering the cost of everyone's food and drinks was proof that I was dependable, that I could carry the weight of my family even when it was inconvenient, even when it meant sacrificing my own comfort. It had become a ritual as predictable as the lights strung on my mother's porch or the cheap pine-scented candles my aunt insisted on bringing, claiming they smelled just like Christmas, when really they smelled like disinfectant. And every year, they let me. Not once did anyone protest or insist on splitting the bill. They would smile at me warmly, pat my hand, and say something about how generous I was, but those words had become empty, just a script they recited while quietly sliding their wallets further into their coats. The first few years, I convinced myself it was fine. I was doing well at work, my paycheck was steady, and I liked the feeling of giving. There was a time when pulling out my card at the end of the night gave me a small sense of pride, as if I were lifting everyone else's burden and proving that I could handle it. But pride has a way of curdling into expectation, and once it curdles, it begins to rot. Somewhere along the way, what started as generosity turned into obligation. I became the one who pays, the dependable one who would never let the holiday end awkwardly by asking others to contribute. I remember a Christmas about 10 years ago when my cousin Jason made a dramatic show of offering his card, waving it in the air like a hero, and then sighing with exaggerated relief when I laughed and said I had it covered. He slid his card back into his wallet so fast I doubt it even touched the table. That was the year I realized this was no longer a gesture of love on my part. It had turned into a role I was expected to play, and every December I stepped into it like a costume. This year, though, was different. It started with a whisper. We had barely sat down, menus still in hand, when I excused myself to the restroom. As I walked back to the table, I caught my aunt's voice cutting through the noise of clinking glasses and holiday music. She was leaned over toward my cousin Melissa, her lips barely moving, but her words sharp enough to slice right through me. He's basically our ATM. It landed in my ears like a slap. Not just the words themselves, but the casual tone, as if she were commenting on the weather or the quality of the bread basket. I froze for a second, standing just behind her, the kind of moment where you feel heat rise up the back of your neck and your jaw clench, because suddenly everything you suspected is confirmed. It wasn't appreciation. It wasn't gratitude. It was mockery disguised as family chatter. I sat down without saying a word. My face stretched into that polite holiday smile I had perfected over the years, but my mind was no longer on the menu or the conversation about who was bringing dessert tomorrow. I kept replaying her whisper in my head, our ATM. That was what I had become to them, not a daughter or a sister or a cousin, not someone with her own life and her own bills, but a machine they could press at the end of dinner, spitting out coverage for their indulgence. I don't think anyone noticed how quiet I went after that. They were too busy debating appetizers, too busy asking if the calamari was worth it this year or whether to go all in on the seafood tower. Jason ordered a cocktail that cost more than my groceries for the week, laughing that it was Christmas after all. My brother asked the waiter about the most expensive steak on the menu, the one listed as market price, and winked at me as if I were in on the joke. I smiled. I laughed when I needed to. I played the part. But something inside me had shifted. I knew then, as I watched them order without a second thought, that I wasn't going to do it this year. I wasn't going to slip my card into the checkbook and save everyone from discomfort. I was going to sit back and watch. Still, the decision didn't come with anger. It came with a strange sense of calm, like I had finally woken up from a long dream and realized I didn't have to play this role anymore. The whisper had freed me, though my aunt had no idea. She thought she was being clever, thought her words were safe in the low hum of holiday chatter, but they had reached me loud and clear. I looked around the table, at my father chuckling over a story he had told a dozen times, at my mother fussing with her napkin, at cousins scrolling their phones between bites of bread, and I realized something else. They weren't bad people, not exactly. They were just comfortable. Too comfortable with the idea that I would always step in, too comfortable with the tradition that served them well while draining me slowly year after year. And comfort makes people blind. So I made my plan. I decided that when the check came, I would wait. I would let the silence hang in the air until it became unbearable, until someone had to move. And then, with the same smile I had worn all night, I would say, "Not tonight. It's on you." They didn't know it yet, but Christmas was about to change. I kept the smile because it was the only thing keeping my face from telling the truth, and while my family debated appetizers with the casual greed of people who have never once had to consider the ugly math of a holiday bill, I let my eyes drift over the menu the way a magician waves a hand over a hat, not because I planned to make money appear, but because I was preparing to make an old illusion disappear without warning. I listened to Jason pronounce the scallops non-negotiable, and to Melissa argue that the truffle fries were basically seasonal vegetables if you squint, and I laughed with them in that practiced, affectionate way that says I'm easygoing and happy to be here. Even as I made a quiet inventory of every entitlement at the table like a cashier counting out a till, the premium cocktails poured into oversized stemware, the seafood tower that always tilts like a skyscraper in a bad earthquake movie. The double appetizers justified as small plates because the word small makes gluttony feel like a spa day. I sipped water because it kept my hands occupied and my head clear, and I let my mother tell me about the neighbor who still had last year's wreath on their door. And I let my father repeat a story about a Christmas when the snow came down so hard the streetlights looked like candle wicks, and I let my brother complain about property taxes while flashing a watch that had its own weather app. And with each indulgent detail, I felt the old reflex rise, the one that says preserve the mood, keep the peace, pick up the tab and tuck the awkwardness into your coat pocket like a receipt you pretend you'll file later, only this time I didn't obey it, because that whisper had rubbed the varnish off the tradition and left the raw wood exposed. And once you see splinters you stop running your hand along the rail. The waiter came back with a grin that said he had already pegged our table. The way seasoned servers can sniff out a group that orders like they're on television and pays like they're on trial, and I asked his name because names matter in moments like these. And he told me it was Daniel, and I said it with the same warmth I reserve for people who have to carry heavy trays through tight spaces filled with bad decisions. I kept up the conversation with the effortless cheerfulness of the designated adult, asked about the specials, pretended to consider the rare steak, made a small joke about how holidays should come with a punch card that earns a free salad by New Year's. And in the soft space after the laughter I leaned in just enough that he could hear me while the others argued about sauces and substitutions, and I said, very gently, that we would be doing separate checks tonight, itemized, please, and that he could bring mine with only water and whatever entree I would eventually choose, because I intended to eat, just not to finance a seafood documentary. Daniel blinked in that professional way that holds surprise without letting it spill, then nodded with a respect that told me he had watched this play in reverse too many times to count. The one where a woman stares at the bill like it's an X-ray of her patience and pays anyway, and for a second I felt the weight slide off my shoulders so cleanly I could almost hear it hit the floor. I sat back and let the room breathe around me while the group chat of my family continued at full volume, the chorus of It's Christmas, and Go Big or Go Home, and We Only Live Once, harmonizing with the clink of ice and the low hum of a piano version of a song that used to make me cry in college, and I thought about the little economies I've practiced all year, the Costco runs timed with coupons, the flexible spending account receipts filed in a neat folder, the impulse dresses left in online carts to wither like unwatered plants, none of which my aunt would ever see when she called me an ATM, with the casual cruelty of someone who has never had to learn the difference between kindness and convenience. I ordered the roast chicken because it tasted like sanity and because every family has one person who orders it and gets mocked for being boring, and I was happy to play the boring woman who slept at night while other people wrestled with shellfish and regret. And when Jason announced that he would try the market price steak because Sarah likes when we treat ourselves, I raised my water and said I love when everyone treats themselves responsibly, which earned a ripple of laughter that carried The faintest aftertaste of confusion, like the first sip of eggnog when you realize someone swapped the cream for skim. Melissa asked whether the crab claws came with extra butter, and my aunt wanted to know if Daniel could just keep the wine coming, and my brother made a toast to family that sounded sweet if you didn't know how much of it was funded like a corporate offsite. And I clinked glasses with all of them, took a small polite sip, and imagined the leather folder landing like a meteor. Later, not on my side of the table, but right in the middle, right where tradition goes to be challenged. Between courses I excused myself to the coat check under the pretense of grabbing lip balm, not because I needed it, but because I wanted to call my bank and confirm that my daily limit was set low enough that if anyone tried to steamroll me with a last-minute run it as usual, the card would politely refuse to enable the fantasy, and when I came back I was lighter again, steadier, a woman who had finally installed a firewall where her patience used to be. I slid into my seat, let the laughter pull me back into the room, and joined a debate about whether Hallmark movies count as cardio if you cry hard enough, and when the main dishes arrived Jason actually clapped, which made Daniel smile as though he had seen bigger claps for smaller victories. Dessert menus appeared with the same theatrical flourish that always knocks people's budgets out at the knees, and the chorus began again, just a taste of the cheesecake, a little chocolate lava cake for the table, maybe the seasonal bread pudding because seasonal is an absolution, and I nodded and said it all looked lovely, and when my aunt leaned toward Melissa and murmured that I was such a doll for making holidays easy, I felt my mouth go soft around a smile that was all teeth and no surrender. I caught Daniel's eye as he hovered with a tray of coffee cups, and with the smallest tilt of my head, the sort of gesture that only registers when two people are paying attention to the same storm, I signaled that it was time. And he understood because good servers always do, and he set down 5 small, tidy check presenters, one in front of each adult, as if he were dealing cards in a game everyone thought they were too good to play, and then the table went very still as if a church bell had rung under the tablecloth, and I folded my napkin carefully in my lap and waited to see who would move first. For a beat that stretched longer than the slow piano version of the carol drifting from the bar, the table behaved like a photograph, all arrested gestures and half-finished smiles, my aunt's hand frozen around the stem of her glass. Jason's mouth parted in a theatrical inhale, Melissa's finger hovering over a dessert menu as though she could will the calories to become abstract, and in that hush I could feel the old choreography looking for me, the graceful reach for my purse, the bright little joke about tradition, the quick slide of the card that would tuck everyone back into comfort, while I sat very still and let the new choreography unspool. The one where each adult read their own name printed neatly on the leather folder and confronted the unglamorous arithmetic of their choices. Daniel, who had the poise of a man who knew where the Real show happened in a restaurant and who understood that dignity and disaster often shared a table, had done exactly as we'd discussed when I took my little stroll to the coat check, and he had placed not only separate checks, but also a crisp line beneath each name listing the specific indulgences in polite, neutral language, which meant my brother's market price steak sat right there like a glossy confession. And Melissa's double dessert introduced itself without shame, and my aunt's keep the wine coming translated into a tidy ladder of bottles that looked less like festivity and more like a spreadsheet with a drinking problem. My mother recovered first, because mothers are trained to put out emotional kitchen fires while wearing oven mitts, and she reached for her folder with a smile that said we were being modern about things. And she murmured something about how separate checks made sense now that everyone had their own tastes, and she shot me a look that was not unkind, more of a quiet question, "Are you all right, dear?" which was funny to me because I felt more all right than I had in years. And I squeezed her hand to let her know that I was not starting a war so much as ending a long occupation. My father cleared his throat and did that half-stand that men perform when the weather changes, as if altitude might teach the room some manners, and he muttered about unnecessary fuss, but even he could see the logic crying out from the ink. He had ordered modestly, and his total was modest too, and once in a while fairness sold itself without requiring a sermon. Jason was louder because loudness is the only tool in his box, and he waved his check like a flag while announcing that separate checks were inefficient and that we should just do what we always do because it keeps the night simple. And I considered the rich hypocrisy of a man who calls simplicity the thing that requires one woman to subsidize everyone's appetite, and I answered with the kind of warm patience that sounds like sugar and tastes like grit, telling him that I loved simple nights too, which was why I had asked Daniel to do the simple thing and bring each adult their own accounting. And when Jason tried the old joke, "Sarah likes when we treat ourselves," I said I adored when grown adults treated themselves and their servers, which was the kind of sentence that wears a polite coat while carrying a very sharp key in its pocket. Melissa went strategic and asked if perhaps the restaurant had made a mistake because we're family, as though shared DNA rendered math sentimental, and my aunt attempted that schoolteacher tone she uses when she wants to wrap control in benevolence, telling Daniel we were one party and should be handled accordingly. But Daniel, who had by now joined me in the quiet sport of refusing to be conscripted into someone else's entitlement, kept his voice level and explained that per my request, the accounts were distinct, tips would be added individually, and he would be happy to answer questions about any item on any bill. And the way he said it carried the faintest suggestion that he had spent too many Decembers watching women swallow their pride like aspirin so other people could chase lobster with tiramisu. I opened my folder, admired the tidy line that read roast chicken, side salad, sparkling water, and set my card inside with a small thank you to Daniel for the care and the speed, and then, because revenge should never be loud when it can be elegant, I placed a second card, one of those prepaid holiday gift cards I had bought on the way here, and loaded with an amount that felt like a message rather than a splurge, on top of my check, and told Daniel, in a voice the table could hear without mistaking it for theater, that the extra was for the staff, a Christmas thank you from the table's former tradition, the one that had retired tonight, and I watched the muscles around my aunt's mouth tighten as she realized the phrase, "our ATM," had been converted into a tip that would not buy her another bottle of the wine she liked to call easy. My mother's lips pressed together the way they do when she decides to approve of something despite herself, and even my father's eyes softened, because whatever else the evening would become, we had guaranteed that the people carrying the plates would not be casualties of our experiment in boundaries. The folders remained closed in front of the others like sealed envelopes from the future, and the table buzzed with the fragile electricity of people learning a new language in public, and when Jason leaned across his steak bones to argue that he hadn't brought the right card and perhaps we could smooth it out this one time, I smiled and told him that, in case of genuine emergency, the manager could run a single card and the rest could transfer their share by the little codes printed at the bottom, because Daniel had thought of everything and I had given him permission to make this humane, and the word humane did an interesting thing to my aunt's face, like lemon on cream. I did not mention the whisper I had heard, not yet, because timing is a tool like any other, and I wanted the lesson to arrive on its own 2 feet rather than be dragged in by accusation, and anyway the room was already teaching it. One discrete subtotal at a time, one fingernail tapping a wallet, one cousin discovering that magnesium supplements could not prevent the sudden heartburn of responsibility. When Daniel returned with my receipt I signed with a flourish I had earned, tucked my copy away, and lifted my glass of water like a quiet toast to the version of me who had waited this long to do something so basic and so radical, and then, because I believe in punctuation, I slid my phone onto the table and opened the family group chat, typed a cheerful message that read, "Merry Christmas, separate checks confirmed, tip generously," and hit send with the kind of serene malice that wears pearls, and as my brother stared at the little QR square like it was a threat, and my aunt patted her purse with the performative distress of a woman who misplaces principles, but never coupons, Daniel's shadow fell across the table with one more envelope in his hand, this one addressed to me by name in the careful handwriting of the manager. And when I opened it, I found not a coupon or a card, but a note that said a bottle at the bar had already been paid for by someone who had just walked in and asked for me, which made my stomach dip once, then twice, because the signature was a first name I had not seen attached to kindness in years, and I looked up to the mirrored back bar and saw, reflected between the garlands and the glass. A familiar profile turning toward our table, just as my aunt finally opened her check and went a shade paler than the linen. He turned slightly as if the mirror behind the bar had called his name, that familiar tilt of the head revealing a profile I knew better than I wished, and for a breath I was back in a smaller life with cheaper dinners and easier laughter. The kind that belonged to people who still believed effort could fix entitlement, and then the present snapped into focus as he lifted two fingers in a greeting that traveled across the garlands like a paper airplane, and my aunt, who had finally summoned the courage to flip open her leather folder and meet the cost of her monologues, went the color of the table linen because recognition, like interest, compounds when you have tried to ignore it. Caleb had never been mine in the way my family assumed. He had been the kind of almost that leaves a permanent outline. A decent man from a decent job who once watched a December check slide toward me and said very softly in the car later that generosity without boundaries is a slow leak, and that he loved. That I was kind, but that kindness wasn't a subsidy, and I had smiled and told him families are complicated, and after one too many holiday evenings where my good mood had to be purchased like parking validation, we had drifted. Not because of one fight, but because of that constant draft a person creates when they say nothing and pay everything. He did not approach our table with fanfare, which is a grace I have always appreciated in people who know the history of a room, but the manager brought over the bottle with a neat card that read, in Caleb's precise printing, for courage, not coverage. And the smallness of the joke wrapped around me like a well-fitted coat, and I thanked the manager with a look that told him the theater could remain tasteful, and poured exactly one small glass, because I did not intend to blur any edges. Tonight, and when my aunt hissed to Melissa that it was inappropriate to involve outsiders in family matters, I replied in a voice that held almost maternal patience that restaurants were public, money was math, and courage was not an outsider. And then I turned to Daniel and asked, as if it were the most natural request in the world, for a printout of the per-person totals with tip suggestions scaled to consumption, because nothing teaches proportion like numbers wearing formal clothes. The printout arrived in tidy columns that could have gone straight into a year-end report, and as Daniel placed them with a neutrality that would have impressed a diplomat, I watched the panic search for exits in faces that had never learned to pay attention to exits, because I had always been the exit, and I felt that quiet, unglamorous satisfaction one gets when a wobbling chair finally sits level on four legs after you stop pretending the wobble is charming. Jason blustered about card limits and holiday timing while adjusting his watch as if it were a moral compass that needed tapping. Melissa attempted a wistful sigh about student loans even though her second dessert had arrived with a gold leaf, which is not a necessity in any economy. My brother started calculating on his phone with the intensity of a person who has only ever treated arithmetic as a competitive sport, and my aunt, who had just read down the ladder of wines that matched her stories glass for glass, tried a different tactic, the one where she inserts my mother like a bookmark between conflict and resolution, asking if Mom had known about this stunt, to which Mom, who possesses a sense of fairness that occasionally wakes from hibernation with a roar, said very calmly that she was learning as she went and that learning in midlife was good for the arteries, which made my father snort, which made me bite the inside of my cheek to keep from laughing. I took my tiny glass and, because ceremony matters when you are overturning a ritual, I stood just enough that conversation tilted my way, and I told them that tonight the staff would be tipped like they mattered because they did. And that next December if we ate together again we would agree on a budget the way adults agree on speed limits, and that I was done performing the role of the cushion that turns every hard edge into a lounge chair. And I said this not with anger but with that strange calm that had arrived when my aunt called me our ATM, the calm that comes when a diagnosis finally explains all the symptoms, and I watched their faces cycle through surprise, performance, and the beginnings of adjustment. Then, because revenge tastes best when it doubles as a habit breaker, I took out a small stack of stamped envelopes I had prepared in a moment of clarity earlier in the week, each one addressed in my hand to a different local charity with missions that would make even a cynical uncle shift in his chair, restaurant workers' emergency funds, single-parent holiday drives. a clinic that quietly pays for prescriptions when people must choose between medicine and rent, and I said that I had taken the liberty of donating, in the family's name, the amount I used to set aside every December for the privilege of keeping us comfortable, and that Daniel had already delivered those letters to the manager to drop in the outgoing mail, because grace moves faster when you plan for it, and the room with the kind of quiet that lights up the nervous system because moral arithmetic, like financial arithmetic, can sting. My aunt opened and closed her mouth like the dining room had shifted altitudes, and then she tried the insinuation, the one that works on people who fear not being liked, suggesting I was making a spectacle, hoping guilt would scurry back into its cage. But I simply looked at her with the tired affection you reserve for relatives who mistake habit for love, and I said that a spectacle is what you get when people assume someone else will always carry the load, and that this was a recalibration, which is less sparkly but much more useful, and I watched her flinch at the word assume because if there is a single syllable that can empty a glass of entitlement faster than a sommelier, it is that one. Caleb stayed at the bar as I knew he would, a witness rather than a participant, and I felt bolstered by his presence without needing it to justify anything, which is, I suppose, what adulthood should feel like, and I was grateful for the reminder. As forks clinked against plates abandoned by appetites that had suddenly misplaced their ambition, my phone buzzed with a message unrelated to the group chat, a notification from a shared drive I kept for documents I didn't want to misplace, confirming that a folder I had labeled, with a streak of dark humor, traditions, and other myths, had finished syncing, and although I didn't open it at the table, I slid the screen face down because suspense is a seasoning and tonight deserved flavor, and I took a breath before I did the one merciful thing I had promised myself I would grant the room, which was to say out loud that I had overheard the whisper, every word, and that I would not be discussing it tonight because I preferred to give people one clean night to experience the world without an ATM and see how it felt, but that tomorrow I would be sending a link in the family chat, a tidy little ledger of transfers and "we'll get you next time" messages collected over the years with more care than anyone had imagined, annotated in plain language and without commentary, because facts do a fine job narrating themselves. I watched the realization slide across my aunt's face like a shadow passing over a sundial. I watched Jason's fingers freeze above his calculator app. I watched my brother count the cost of old jokes, and then, before anyone could mount a defense or spin a story, I raised the small glass in a toast to new traditions and honest math, left my signature on the receipt where Daniel had marked the line for extra tip to be divided among the staff, and sat down with the kind of finality that makes people understand the meeting has ended, even as an unresolved chord hung in the air because the link was not yet sent and the folder had not yet been opened. And sometimes the most effective revenge is the one that lets the room imagine its own consequences for one long, sleepless night. The moment stretched like taffy pulled by invisible hands until the room, which had been held together by the thin sugar of holiday pretense, began to wobble under the weight of arithmetic spoken aloud. And I watched my aunt blink at the column that translated her generosity speeches into a neat, guiltless sum that did not include the interest she had always charged in stories later, while Jason performed a small pantomime of frustrated masculinity involving pockets, notifications, and a repeatedly shaken phone, and Melissa tapped her card against the presenter with the anxious determination of a person who believes machines can be shamed into compliance, and through it all Daniel moved like a steady violinist in a clumsy parade, offering clarity when asked, patience when stalled, and a pen when someone, at last, surrendered to adulthood with a sigh that sounded suspiciously like a holiday hymn sung off-key. I did not gloat because gloating is cheap and I had already paid full price for years, but I allowed myself the quiet satisfaction of noticing how silence had shifted allegiance, no longer the blanket I used to throw over discomfort to suffocate it until dessert, but a clean space in which discomfort had to breathe on its own and, finding oxygen scarce, adapt or leave. Caleb remained a reflective glint at the bar, not entering the scene yet somehow deepening its color, and when our eyes met in the mirror I saw not triumph but recognition, the kind people carry when they have learned, sometimes painfully, That the boundary between love and obligation is not a hedge you can trim twice a year, but a living border you have to tend daily. And I felt something unclench that had nothing and everything to do with money, because I realized that the person I wanted to be respected by had finally shown up, me. The version who asks for what is fair without apologizing for ruining anyone's nostalgia for a tradition that only existed because someone else paid. My mother signed her receipt with a flourish that tried on pride like a new scarf and found that it fit. My father tucked his copy away with a small nod that was both apology and endorsement, and my aunt, who had perfected the art of sounding wounded while picking the pockets of other people's goodwill, tried one last maneuver in which she declared that Christmas had been cheapened by math, to which I replied, evenly and without heat, that Christmas had been cheapened by assumptions long before tonight, and that the math merely put lights on a tree that had been dark on purpose. I knew revenge requires a closing gesture, a period at the end of a long, run-on sentence of politeness, so I stood just as plates were cleared and thanked Daniel loudly enough for neighboring tables to hear. Not to embarrass my family, but to secure for the staff the kind of public gratitude that makes managers schedule them on the good nights, and I added, for absolute avoidance of doubt, that the additional tip had been placed in the envelope for the whole team because holidays often praise the visible and forget the people who carry heavy trays through tight rooms, and I watched his shoulders drop a fraction as if a weight had been set down where it belonged. Then, with the stage properly lit, I opened the family chat and scheduled the message I had promised, a link to the folder titled Traditions and Other Myths, a collection of screenshots, bank transfers, calendar entries, and neatly labeled notes that contained no commentary and no accusation beyond the plain sequence of dates, amounts, and the familiar chorus of "We'll get you next time," as well as a single audio clip labeled The Whisper, which I had recorded because phones make archivists of us all and because sometimes the difference between hearsay and hearing is simply pressing a red button, and I set the send time for 5 minutes past midnight, a courtesy that would allow everyone to make it home before their phones told them the truth in my handwriting. When checks were finally closed with the stuttering cadence of a car learning to idle, my aunt announced that she had forgotten her purse in the car and performed a slow rummage that would have impressed a stage magician, at which point Jason volunteered to spot her with a tone that suggested heroism rather than circle of consequence, and Melissa declared that Venmo would sort it out later, and I, who had predicted each beat with the grim accuracy of a seasoned weather forecaster, reminded them gently that Daniel could run multiple forms of payment now and that later was a village where debts go to start a family, and I smiled without malice as my aunt finally produced the purse she had not forgotten, a velvet thing that always smelled faintly of theater, and inserted a card with the careful dignity of someone learning to walk in a new gravity. We stood, then, an awkward bouquet of coats and scarves, and my mother hugged me in a way she had not since I was a teenager who had done something brave and slightly foolish. My father cleared his throat as if a small confession wanted to come out and decided to wait until morning to be born, and my brother, who is better than he behaves when Jason is watching, muttered that a budget would not kill him and that steak had not been worth the lecture his stomach was currently delivering. At the door, Caleb reached us by accident or design, and he said my name with the kind of careful ease that people use when they have no interest in rewriting history but would like to underline a line of it. And he told my mother she looked the same as the year we took her to the light show and got lost in the parking lot for an hour, and my mother laughed with genuine warmth because she remembers the parking lot and not the argument that followed. And he turned to me and said that sometimes courage is just math you say out loud, and I said that sometimes love is too, and he smiled with his eyes before stepping back, leaving behind nothing more than another small card that read, "For next time, your call," which I pocketed without a promise, because ambiguity, handled cleanly, is a bridge not a trap. We walked into the kind of winter air that clarifies everything it touches, and despite the familiar ache that comes with ending a long performance, I felt oddly spacious, as though rooms I had been renting in other people's expectations had finally been vacated and the keys slid under the door. In the quiet of my apartment, I poured the last half glass from the bottle he had sent, not as a prelude to sleep, but as a ceremony for the part of me that had always been braced for the bill. And at 12:05 the message left my phone like a lantern set adrift on a cold river, and I watched the read receipts bloom one by one in the dark. A few minutes later my father texted a simple, "Come by tomorrow, please," which could have been an indictment or an invitation, and my aunt's typing bubble appeared and disappeared 3 times like a small animal testing the air, and Jason sent nothing, which meant either fury or thought, both of which I could live with. Caleb wrote, "Proud of you. Regardless," and then, wisely, nothing else, and I placed the phone face down on the table and listened to the building settle, the heater ticking like a metronome set to a new time signature, and I wondered, as anyone does after a victory that feels suspiciously like a beginning, whether I had freed something or simply rearranged the bars of a cage, whether next December would find us at a table where budgets were agreed upon and kindness didn't need a receipt, or whether the whisper would evolve into a story about a difficult woman who ruined Christmas with arithmetic, and I smiled at the unanswered question because it was honest, because it would keep them thinking, and because, after all these years of paying for endings, it felt like time to invest in an open one.